Welcome to Moon's Fairy Tales. Today, we continue our journey into the depths of Middle-earth with the Shadows of Sauron, Part 2. Galadriel has uncovered the lost city of Galadhon, where an ancient darkness far older than Sauron stirs beneath the earth. What horrors await her as she descends deeper into the heart of the shadow? Join us as we explore the twisted remnants of Morgoth's legacy, the trials that test Galadriel's resolve, and the dark forces that threaten to rise once again. Sit back, relax, and let the shadows of Middle-earth draw you in. Chapter 6, Into the Shadow. The air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and decay as Galadriel and Thandor descended deeper into the earth. They had left the ruin of Galadhon behind, but the shadow that had gripped the city now seemed to press even harder around them, sinking its claws into their very minds. The path beneath the mountains wound ever downward, the walls narrowing as they ventured further into the depths of the world. A sense of foreboding clung to every step, and with each passing moment, the weight of the shadow seemed to grow. "This place is older than memory," Thandor muttered, his voice echoing faintly in the narrow tunnel. His hand hovered near the hilt of his sword, but he knew it would be of little use here. "What is this darkness we follow?" Galadriel's eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light. "It is a remnant of a power that predates even the fall of Morgoth. A darkness that was buried deep within the world when he was cast down." She paused, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But Sauron found it." Thandor frowned, his steps slowing. "If it is so ancient, why has it not been awakened before?" Galadriel did not answer immediately. Her thoughts were elsewhere, deep within the recesses of her mind where the whispers of the shadow had begun to stir. Sauron sought to control this power. But even he was too late. He only managed to twist its edges, like the first breath of smoke before a fire. Now, it waits, hungry and untethered. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, its ceiling disappearing into the darkness above. The walls were slick with moisture, and strange, faintly glowing runes lined the stone. The air here was colder, sharper, as if the darkness itself had substance. Galadriel felt it pressing in on her, a pulse of malevolence that quickened with their presence. This was the heart of the shadow. "We are close," she whispered. As they moved further into the cavern, the oppressive weight of the place seemed to intensify, as though the earth itself were trying to push them back. The shadows twisted and writhed at the edges of their vision, but when they turned to look, there was nothing there. Thandor's breathing had grown shallow, and he glanced at Galadriel, his eyes betraying his unease. "What lies beneath us?" he asked. What could be so powerful that even Sauron failed to master it? Galadriel's voice was low, her gaze fixed ahead. "There are secrets buried deep within the world, secrets that even the Vala have not touched. Morgoth was the first to seek them, but he was cast down before he could truly unleash their power. Sauron followed, but he was never his master's equal. He could only bend fragments of that ancient malice to his will." They reached the center of the cavern, where the stone floor was cracked and uneven, as though something had broken through from below. In the middle of the room stood a towering obelisk, its surface black as night and pulsing faintly with a deep, crimson glow. The runes carved into its surface twisted and changed before their eyes, as though the stone itself were alive. Galadriel approached the obelisk, her expression hardening. "This is the source," she said, her voice barely audible. "This is what Sauron tried to awaken." Thandor stepped forward cautiously, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. "What is it?" "Some kind of relic." Galadriel shook her head. "It is not a relic. It is a prison." As the words left her lips, the ground beneath them trembled. The shadows that had been lurking at the edges of their vision surged forward, coalescing into dark, indistinct shapes that circled the obelisk. The air grew colder still, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, like the groan of something immense waking from a long slumber. Galadriel raised her hand, the light of the phial of Erendel flaring to life in her palm. The shadows recoiled from the light, but they did not retreat. Instead, they began to close in, their forms flickering as they drew nearer. "We cannot stay here," Thandor said, his voice tight with fear. "We have to go back." "No," Galadriel said firmly, her gaze never leaving the obelisk. "We must face this. If we turn back now, the darkness will only spread. We have to bind it, before it breaks free." Thandor hesitated, but he knew there was no arguing with her. He drew his sword, his eyes scanning the shadows that now surrounded them. "Whatever you need to do it quickly," he said, his voice tense. Galadriel stepped closer to the obelisk, her hand hovering over its surface. The runes on the stone pulsed in response to her presence, their glow intensifying. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent, and for a moment, she felt as though the shadows were pressing into her thoughts, trying to invade her mind. But she pushed them back, her will as strong as steel. "This is where it ends," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable resolve. She began to speak in the ancient tongue, her words carrying a power older than the stones themselves. The runes on the obelisk flared, and the shadows around them began to writhe and twist, their forms distorting as though they were being torn apart by some unseen force. But as Galadriel spoke the words of binding, something shifted. A presence stirred from deep within the earth, something older and darker than anything they had faced before. The very air seemed to shudder as it awoke, and a voice, low and resonant, echoed through the chamber. "Galadriel." The voice was not human, nor elven. It was something deeper, more ancient, a voice that had not been heard in the world since the time of Morgoth. It filled the cavern with its presence, and Galadriel felt its power pressing against her mind, trying to force its way in. "You cannot contain me," the voice said, its tone filled with malice. "I was here long before you were born, and I will remain long after you are gone." Galadriel's breath caught in her throat, but she did not falter. She spoke the words of binding louder now, her voice filled with determination. The light of the phial blazed brighter, casting long shadows across the chamber. But the darkness fought back. The shadows surged toward them, and Galadriel could feel their malice clawing at her, trying to break through her defenses. Her mind began to blur, the edges of her thoughts growing hazy as the voice whispered in her ear, filling her with doubts, fears, memories of her own past that she had long tried to forget. Suddenly, the images of her past flooded her mind. She saw herself standing in the courts of Doriath, a young elf, filled with ambition and pride. She saw the faces of those she had loved and lost, Finrod, her beloved brother, who had fallen in the dark pits of Tolan Gorhoth. She saw herself standing at the brink of the mirror of Galadriel, her heart torn between the light and the temptation of the One Ring. The shadows fed on her memories, drawing strength from her doubts, her regrets. For a moment, she felt herself falter, her resolve weakening as the weight of her long years pressed down upon her. But then, a new memory surfaced, a memory of Frodo, standing before her in Lothlorien, offering her the ring. She had seen the power it could grant her, the power to become a queen, strong and terrible. But she had rejected it. She had chosen the path of light, despite the darkness that had always whispered at the edges of her heart. With a cry, she drew on that memory, pushing back the shadows that sought to consume her. "You will not take me," she shouted, her voice ringing through the chamber. The light of the phial flared brighter than ever, and the shadows recoiled, their forms unraveling as the power of the light drove them back. The voice in her mind screamed in fury, but it was growing fainter now, its grip loosening. Galadriel raised her hand, and with a final, powerful word, she completed the binding spell. The runes on the obelisk flared one last time before dimming, their light fading into the stone. The shadows around them dissipated, melting back into the darkness from which they had come. The presence was gone. Galadriel stood still for a long moment, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The chamber was silent now, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted. The air was still cold, but the malevolence that had once filled the cavern was gone. Thander sheathed his sword, his face pale. "Is it over?" Galadriel nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now." They left the chamber in silence, their footsteps echoing through the empty tunnel as they made their way back toward the surface. The journey was long, and though the shadow had been bound, Galadriel knew that the threat had not truly been vanquished. It had merely been contained, its power locked away deep within the earth, where it would sleep for another age. But even in sleep, the darkness remained. As they emerged from the mountain, the light of the sun bathed the land once more. But Galadriel's heart was heavy. The shadow of Morgoth still lingered in the world, and though they had won a small victory, she knew the true battle was far from over. And when the shadow awoke again, it would be stronger than ever. Chapter 7: The Last Betrayal. The ascent from the depths of the earth was slow, burdened by the weight of the shadow they had just faced. Galadriel and Thander climbed in silence, their breaths shallow in the cold, stifling air of the tunnels. The echoes of the ancient darkness they had bound still lingered in the back of their minds, like the fading memory of a nightmare that could not be fully shaken. The mountain above them felt heavier with each step, and though they had left the dark heart behind, the shadow had not truly released its grip. It clung to them, unseen, yet palpable, as if waiting for the moment when their resolve might falter. The light of the phial of Erendel dimmed as they moved closer to the surface, its glow flickering faintly in the gloom. "We are not free of it," Thander muttered, his voice low and strained. He had spoken little since they had left the chamber beneath the earth, but now there was something dark in his tone, a tension that had not been there before. Galadriel turned her gaze toward him, her eyes narrowing as she studied his face. There was a coldness in his expression that unsettled her, though she could not yet place its source. The shadows had touched them both deeply, but something else now lurked in Thander's eyes, a flicker of malice, a shadow of doubt. "It lingers still," Galadriel said softly, her voice calm but edged with warning. "The darkness does not let go so easily." Thander's eyes flashed as he met her gaze. "And what if it never lets go?" His voice was sharper now, a hint of accusation creeping into his words. "What if we have only delayed the inevitable, Galadriel? What if everything we have done has been for nothing?" The question hung in the air between them, thick with tension. Galadriel held his gaze for a long moment before speaking. "We have done what we must. The darkness has been bound, its power sealed for now. But it is true, there will always be shadows in this world. That is the nature of Middle-earth." Thander's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword as if seeking comfort in its weight. "Shadows, you speak of them as if they are mere things to be dealt with. But what of the darkness that grows within us, Lady Galadriel? Can it be so easily bound?" Galadriel's heart quickened, and a flicker of unease passed through her. She could feel it now, the shift in Thander's spirit, the subtle pull of the shadow that had found a place within him. The darkness they had faced below had taken root in his mind, twisting his thoughts, feeding his doubts. "The shadow preys on weakness," she said, her voice firm. "It seeks to corrupt those who carry fear and doubt in their hearts. You must resist it, Thander." He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed through the tunnel. "Resist? You speak as though it is a choice. But the truth is, I no longer know if I want to resist." Galadriel's breath caught in her throat. The tension between them crackled in the still air, and she stepped forward, her voice filled with urgency. Thander, this is the shadow speaking through you. You are not yourself. He turned to her, his eyes blazing with something dark and dangerous. No, Galadriel, I am more myself now than I ever was. I have seen the truth of this world. The light you cling to so desperately, it is weak. The shadow is strong. And I have embraced it. Galadriel felt the ground shift beneath her, not physically, but in her heart. She had sensed the shadow's influence before, but she had not expected it to consume Thander so completely. Now, she saw him as he truly was, twisted by the darkness, a servant of the shadow, though he had not yet fully realized it himself. This is not you, Thander, she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. You have fought by my side through this journey. You have stood against the darkness before. Do not let it claim you now. His hand tightened on his sword, and for a moment, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. But then, the shadow deepened, and his expression hardened once more. I am done fighting it, Galadriel. The light, the endless struggle, it is all for nothing. The shadow has already won, and you are blind if you cannot see it. With a sudden, violent motion, Thander drew his sword and pointed it at her. His voice trembled with anger and despair. You are the one who is blind. You speak of resisting the shadow, but you carry it within you. You have always carried it. You think I have not seen it. The darkness in your heart, the temptation you hide behind your wisdom and your power. You could have taken the ring. You could have used it. But you were afraid. Galadriel's heart ached at his words, for they struck deeper than any blade. She had always known the shadow was in her, waiting, whispering. She had faced it when Frodo offered her the One Ring, and she had resisted. But it had never truly left her. Even now, she could feel it, lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting for the moment of weakness. Yes, she said quietly, her voice filled with a deep, ancient sadness. I have known the shadow. I have faced it, and I have resisted it. But it is not fear that held me back, Thander. It is wisdom. The power of the shadow is corrupting. It destroys everything it touches. I chose to resist, because I knew that to embrace it would be to lose myself. Thander's face twisted with rage. You chose weakness, he shouted, his sword gleaming in the dim light. And now you will pay for it. He lunged at her, his blade aimed straight for her heart. But Galadriel did not flinch. With a swift, fluid motion, she raised her hand, and the light of the phial of Erendel flared to life once more, its brilliance blinding in the darkness of the tunnel. Thander's strike faltered, his blade missing its mark as the light seared his vision. Galadriel stepped back, her heart heavy with sorrow. I do not wish to harm you, Thander. But I will not let the shadow take you. He growled in frustration, his eyes burning with fury. You cannot stop it. The shadow is in me now, and it will not be driven out. Galadriel's voice softened. The shadow can only take what you allow it to. It feeds on your anger, your despair. You must fight it. Thander hesitated, his breath ragged as he struggled against the pull of the darkness. For a moment, Galadriel thought she saw a flicker of the man he had once been, the brave ranger who had stood beside her against the evils of Middle-earth. But then, the shadow surged within him, and his face twisted with hatred once more. You are a fool, Galadriel, he spat, his voice trembling with rage. You think you can save me? You think you can stop the shadow? It is inside you as well. You are no different from me. With a cry, he charged at her again, his sword flashing in the dim light. But this time, Galadriel did not retreat. She raised her hand once more, and the light of the file blazed brighter than ever before, filling the tunnel with a searing, radiant glow. Thander screamed as the light engulfed him, his sword falling from his hand as he stumbled back. The shadow within him writhed and twisted, fighting against the light, but it could not hold. With a final, desperate cry, Thander collapsed to the ground, his body trembling as the darkness was driven from him. Galadriel knelt beside him, her heart aching with sorrow. Thander's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, the rage and malice were gone. He looked up at her, his expression filled with regret. I am sorry, he whispered, his voice weak and trembling. I could not fight it. Galadriel placed a hand on his forehead, her touch gentle. It is not your fault, she said softly. The shadow is powerful. It seeks to corrupt even the strongest of us. Thander's breath shuddered, and he closed his eyes. I am tired, Galadriel. So tired. Galadriel's eyes filled with tears as she gazed down at him. Rest now, Thander. Your struggle is over. He exhaled one final, soft breath, and then he was still. The tunnel was silent, save for the faint echo of Galadriel's quiet sobs as she knelt beside the fallen ranger. The light of the file dimmed, casting long, pale shadows on the stone walls. For a long time, Galadriel did not move. The weight of her grief pressed down on her, and the shadow she had fought so hard to resist whispered once more in the corners of her mind. The battle against the darkness was never truly over. It was always there, waiting, lurking, ready to strike when the light faltered. And now, she was alone. Chapter 8, The Curse of Malice. Galadriel stood alone at the edge of the world. The blackened plains before her stretched as far as her eyes could see, the sky above choked by a dull, gray haze that seemed to swallow the very light. This land, desolate and forsaken, was where the final remnants of Sauron's will had come to rest, an eternal curse, etched into the earth like a scar that would never heal. She had followed the trail here, to the heart of the east, where shadows still lingered in the wake of the Dark Lord's fall. But this place was not a mere reminder of Sauron's malice, it was alive with it. The ground beneath her feet pulsed faintly, as though something dark and terrible stirred beneath the surface. The air hummed with an ancient, oppressive energy that clung to her skin, its weight like a shroud. It was here, in this land of ruin, that Galadriel would face her final challenge. The cost, she knew, would be great. The memory of Thander's betrayal lingered heavy in her heart as she made her way deeper into the cursed land. She had buried him beneath the cold stone of the mountain, the light of the file her only witness. His face, twisted by the shadow's corruption, haunted her thoughts. The darkness had claimed him, despite all her efforts, and his fall served as a bitter reminder that no one, not even she, was immune to the malice of the world. The path ahead was treacherous, winding through fields of twisted, blackened trees and broken earth. The land had been scorched by war, and the scars of that ancient conflict still marred the landscape. It was here, long ago, that the armies of the last alliance had marched, and it was here that Sauron had fled, wounded but defiant, in the final days before his fall. Now, it was a graveyard of forgotten battles, a place where the dead whispered, and the living dared not tread. As she approached the heart of the cursed land, the ground beneath her feet began to change. The soil grew darker, richer, as though it had been saturated with blood. Strange symbols carved into the earth glowed faintly in the gloom, their meaning lost to time but their power undeniable. This was no natural place, it had been shaped by dark forces, twisted and corrupted by Sauron's will. At the center of it all stood a monolith, black as night and slick with some strange, viscous substance that seemed to ooze from its surface. It towered above her, its edges sharp and jagged, as though it had been hewn from the heart of the world itself. The air around it thrummed with malice, the faint sound of whispers carried on the wind. They were the voices of the dead, of those who had fallen in Sauron's service, bound to this cursed place for eternity. Galadriel stood before the monolith, her heart heavy with the weight of the task before her. This was the last remnant of Sauron's power, not a living being, but an eternal curse, woven into the very fabric of the land. It was a presence that could not be defeated by force or by will alone. It would require something more. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the surface of the stone. At her touch, the monolith pulsed with a dark, sickly light, and the whispers grew louder. Galadriel felt the weight of the curse pressing in on her mind, like the pull of a great tide. The darkness here was ancient, tied not only to Sauron but to Morgoth, his master. It was a curse that stretched back to the First Age, a legacy of malice that could never be fully erased. To bind it, she would need to offer something of herself, something dear. The ritual she needed to perform was one of the oldest known to the Eldar, a binding that required the full strength of her will and the sacrifice of something precious. In the past, such rituals had been used to contain the power of fallen Maer or to seal away the remnants of Morgoth's influence in the world. But this curse was different. It was not a mere fragment of evil. It was the essence of Sauron's malice, the last piece of his will that remained in Middle-earth. Galadriel knelt before the monolith, her hand resting on its cold surface. She could feel the darkness within it, writhing like a living thing, eager to consume her. The phial of Erendel glowed faintly at her side, but even its light seemed weak in the face of the curse's overwhelming power. Her voice was soft but steady as she began to speak the words of the ancient binding. They were words in the tongue of the Vala, a language older than the world itself, and as she spoke them, the air around her seemed to tremble. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the curse was fighting against her will. The cost of the ritual weighed heavily on her heart. She knew what she would have to give, what the curse demanded. To bind it, she would have to leave behind something of herself. A part of her very soul would be bound to the curse, trapped within the land, never to be reclaimed. The sacrifice was not one of flesh or blood, but of something deeper, her connection to the light. Galadriel had carried the light of the two trees of Valinor within her heart for thousands of years, a remnant of her time in Aman, a reminder of the peace and beauty that had once been. It was a light that had guided her through the darkest of times, that had given her strength when all seemed lost. And now, she would have to give it up. She closed her eyes, her breath steady as she prepared herself for what must be done. The curse pulsed before her, eager and hungry, waiting for her to make the sacrifice. The light within her flickered, its warmth fading as she began to release it, letting it slip from her grasp. The whispers grew louder, the darkness pressing in on her mind, but she did not waver. The ground trembled beneath her, and the monolith shuddered as the binding took hold. The air around her grew thick with malice, the curse fighting against her will, but Galadriel held firm. She spoke the final words of the ritual, her voice rising above the whispers, and with a final, blinding flash of light, the curse was sealed. The monolith fell silent. Galadriel remained kneeling before the stone, her hand resting on its cold surface, her body trembling from the effort. The light within her was gone, snuffed out like a flame. She felt its absence keenly, like a wound that would never heal. The warmth that had once filled her heart had been replaced by a cold emptiness, and though the curse was bound, the price she had paid weighed heavily on her soul. The whispers had faded, but the darkness remained. It would always remain, a part of the world, a part of her. The curse had been sealed, but it had taken something from her, something that could never be restored. Galadriel rose slowly, her body weak from the strain of the ritual. The land around her was silent now, the oppressive weight of the curse lifted, but the scars of its presence remained. The ground was still blackened, the trees twisted and broken, and the sky above was still choked with ash and smoke. The curse was bound, but it had left its mark on the land, just as it had left its mark on her. She looked down at the phial of Erendil, its light now faint and dim. The power within it had been diminished by the sacrifice, just as her own strength had been. The light would never burn as brightly again. But the curse was contained. The last remnant of Sauron's will had been sealed away, buried deep within the earth, where it would sleep for another age. As Galadriel turned to leave the cursed land, a deep, overwhelming sorrow settled over her. The battle had been won, but at a terrible cost. She had given up a part of herself, her connection to the light, her strength, and though she had succeeded in binding the curse, she knew she would never be the same. The world, too, had changed. The shadow of Sauron had been lifted, but the scars of his malice would never fully heal. The land would bear his mark for as long as Middle-earth endured, and though the darkness had been sealed, it would never be gone. It would always wait, just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when the light faltered once more. Chapter 9, Galadriel's Final Stand. The wind howled across the desolate plain, carrying with it the whispers of a time long past. As Galadriel stood at the threshold of the dark place where her final task awaited, she felt the weight of ages pressing upon her. The land was barren, marked by deep fissures and scorched earth, a place where the very air seemed to throb with malice. This was where the last vestige of Sauron's will remained, a shadow that had not yet been fully extinguished. Galadriel's heart was heavy with the knowledge that this would be her final confrontation with the darkness she had pursued. She had bound the curse of the land, but now, in the deepest recesses of Middle-earth, she could feel the true echo of Sauron waiting. It was not a physical form she would face, but something far more insidious, the lingering malice of Annatar, the deceiver, who had once tricked the elves into forging the rings of power. The shadows had lengthened, and the light of the phial of Erendil was now but a dim glow at her side, its strength almost spent. The journey had taken its toll, and the sacrifice she had made to bind the curse had drained her of the light she had once carried within her. Yet she knew there could be no turning back now. The entrance to the cavern yawned before her, black and deep, as though the mountain itself was trying to swallow her whole. Galadriel hesitated for a brief moment, feeling the heaviness in the air, the dark presence waiting within. She could sense the malice, the hatred, like a slow poison creeping through the land. It was not Sauron in body, but it was his will, the essence of his deception and cruelty, woven into the very fabric of this place. She entered the cavern, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. The darkness seemed alive, clinging to her as she moved deeper into the mountain's heart. The air grew colder, and the faint whispers that had followed her since she arrived became louder, more insistent. They were not the whispers of the dead, but the voice of Annatar, the form Sauron had taken when he had first deceived the elves. Galadriel. The voice whispered, soft and cruel. It slithered into her mind like a serpent, winding through her thoughts, touching on her deepest fears. You come to end me, but do you not see? You are too late. My will has already taken root in this world. Galadriel clenched her fists, her heart quickening as she moved toward the source of the voice. I have faced you before, and I will face you again, she said, her voice steady but laced with sorrow. You are but a shadow, a remnant of a power that is fading. The voice chuckled, a sound that echoed through the cavern like the grinding of stones. And yet, here you stand, seeking to bind me once more. But you cannot. The darkness that I have sown has grown too deep. Even now, it festers in the hearts of men, in the very soil of Middle-earth. The cavern widened into a vast chamber, and at its center stood a throne of black stone, towering and grotesque. It seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and seated upon it was a figure, Annatar, the fair and terrible form that Sauron had once taken. His face was beautiful but twisted by malice, his eyes gleaming with the remnants of his ancient power. He smiled as Galadriel entered the chamber, his form flickering like a shadow caught between worlds. "You should have taken the ring when you had the chance," he said, his voice smooth and filled with mockery. "You could have been a queen, Galadriel, strong and beautiful, feared and revered. But instead, you chose the path of weakness." Galadriel's breath caught in her throat as the memory of the ring flashed in her mind. She had resisted the temptation then, but the shadow of that choice had lingered with her ever since. She had seen the path she might have taken, had she accepted the power of the One Ring, and it had terrified her. But even now, she felt the faint pull of that power, the seductive whisper of what could have been. "I chose the path of wisdom," she said, her voice low but firm. "I chose to reject your lies, Sauron." Annatar rose from the throne, his form gliding toward her, his eyes narrowing with a dangerous light. "Did you? Or have you simply been running from the truth? You think you have defeated me, but I am in every shadow, in every corner of this world. The darkness will never truly die." Galadriel stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "Your darkness is fading. You are but a memory, clinging to the ruins of a power that is no more. I will finish what was begun, and I will bind you forever." Annatar's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure malice. "You are a fool, Galadriel. You think you can bind me. You think you can contain the darkness. It will rise again, as it always has. And when it does, you will be nothing but a faded whisper in the wind." Galadriel raised the phial of Erendil, its light flickering faintly in the gloom. She began to speak the words of the ancient binding, her voice steady but filled with the weight of centuries. The light of the phial grew brighter, casting long shadows across the chamber, and Annatar hissed as the power of the binding spell began to take hold. The ground trembled beneath her, and the air grew thick with the power of the curse she sought to bind. Annatar's form flickered and wavered, his eyes burning with fury as the light of the phial grew stronger. "You think this will stop me?" he snarled, his voice rising in anger. "You think you can bind me forever?" Galadriel's voice did not falter. The words of the binding were old as the world itself, passed down through the ages by the Elves. They were words of light, of hope, meant to contain the darkest of evils. But even as she spoke them, she felt the weight of the cost, the sacrifice she would have to make. Annatar lunged toward her, his form twisting and stretching as he tried to break free of the binding spell. The shadows around him writhed and lashed out, but the light of the phial held them at bay. Still, Galadriel could feel the strain, the darkness pressing in on her, trying to crush her under its weight. The voice of Annatar was in her mind now, slithering through her thoughts like a venomous snake. "You are weak," he hissed. "You always have been. You carry the shadow within you, just as I do. You cannot escape it." Galadriel's heart trembled. She knew the truth of his words. She had carried the shadow with her for as long as she could remember, the temptation of power, the desire to rule, the fear of the darkness that lurked within her. But she had also carried the light, the hope of a world free from the corruption that Sauron had spread. And now, she would have to choose. With a final, powerful word, she completed the binding spell. The light of the phial flared brighter than the sun, and the shadows screamed as they were consumed by its brilliance. Annatar's form writhed and twisted, his eyes wide with fury and fear as the power of the binding took hold. But even as he was bound, Galadriel knew that the cost would be great. The light of the file faded, and the chamber fell silent. Annatar's form was gone, consumed by the binding spell, but the darkness had not left her. It clung to her, a heavy weight pressing on her spirit. She had won, but at a terrible price. Galadriel collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The binding had taken more from her than she had anticipated. She could feel the darkness still, lingering at the edges of her mind, a shadow that would never fully fade. She had bound the last remnant of Sauron's will, but in doing so, she had left a part of herself behind in the darkness. Her light was diminished, her spirit marked by the shadows she had fought so hard to resist. As she rose to her feet, the weight of the centuries pressed down upon her. She had won, but she knew that the darkness would always remain, waiting for the moment when the light faltered. For now, the shadow was sealed, and Middle-earth would be free from its malice. But Galadriel's heart was heavy with the knowledge that the battle against the darkness was never truly over. It would rise again, as it always had, and when it did, she would be ready. But at what cost? Chapter 10, Ashes of Time. The journey back to Lothlorien was long and silent. The lands Galadriel passed through had begun to heal from the ravages of war, but there was still an unease in the air, a sense that the shadow, though defeated, had left its mark on Middle-earth. The forests were quiet, the rivers sluggish, and the sky, though bright with sunlight, seemed a shade dimmer than it once had been. Galadriel rode alone, her cloak pulled tight against the cold wind that swept down from the mountains. She had spent so long in the depths of darkness that the light of the world now felt distant, almost foreign to her. The sacrifice she had made to bind the last of Sauron's will had left her changed, and the weight of that change pressed down on her with every step of her horse. As she crossed into the borders of Lothlorien, the trees whispered her name in soft, familiar voices, but they, too, seemed muted, as though even they could sense the darkness that still lingered in her heart. The golden woods of Lothlorien spread out before her, unchanged yet different. The land had not felt the direct touch of war, but it was as though the shadow that had touched the world had left its imprint even here. The beauty of the forest was undiminished, but Galadriel saw it now with new eyes, eyes that had looked into the depths of Middle-earth's most ancient and terrible darkness. As she approached Kara's Galadhan, the city of trees where her people lived, she felt a pang of sorrow deep within her. This had once been her sanctuary, her place of peace, where she had ruled with wisdom and grace. Now, it felt distant, as though it no longer belonged to her, or she to it. The elves greeted her with quiet reverence, sensing the change in her, though they did not know its cause. Celeborn, her husband, met her at the foot of the great Malorn tree where they had once ruled together. His eyes were filled with concern as he took her hands in his. "You have returned," he said softly. "But you are not as you were." Galadriel looked up into his eyes, and for a moment, she saw reflected there the years they had spent together, the light and joy they had shared. But that light was now dimmed by the shadow that clung to her, the darkness she had fought so hard to contain. "I am not," she whispered. "The journey has changed me, Celeborn. I have bound the last of Sauron's malice, but the cost." She trailed off, unable to find the words to describe the weight of the sacrifice she had made. Celeborn's face softened, and he drew her into an embrace, though she did not feel the comfort she had once known in his arms. "Whatever the cost, you have done what was needed," he said. "The shadow has been lifted from the world." Galadriel closed her eyes, resting her head against his chest. The shadow never truly leaves. It only sleeps, waiting for the day when the light falters again. In the days that followed, Galadriel moved through the golden woods in silence, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she had lost. Her people looked to her for guidance, but she found herself unable to offer them the same light and wisdom she once had. The phial of Erendel, though still in her possession, no longer glowed as brightly as it once had, and the light within her, the light that had once shone so fiercely, was now only a faint flicker. She wandered the paths of Lothlorien alone, her thoughts consumed by the shadow that had taken root in her heart. She had defeated Sauron, but in doing so, she had bound herself to the darkness she had sought to destroy. The power of Annatar, the deceiver, had left its mark on her soul, and though she had resisted his temptations, she knew that a part of him would always remain within her. The golden leaves of the Malorn trees whispered softly in the wind, their voices full of ancient wisdom, but Galadriel no longer felt their presence as she once had. The light of Valinor, the memory of the two trees, which had once guided her, now seemed distant and unreachable. One evening, as the sun began to set over the forest, casting long shadows across the land, Galadriel stood before the mirror of Galadriel, the silver basin where she had once shown the future to others. The water shimmered in the fading light, but as she looked into its depths, she saw only her own reflection, her face marked by the passage of time and the burden of her journey. "I have given so much," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft rustling of the trees. "And yet the darkness remains." She reached out her hand, dipping her fingers into the water. For a moment, the surface rippled, and she saw visions of the past, the creation of the Rings of Power, the betrayal of Sauron, the long years of war and suffering that had followed. She saw herself standing before Frodo, offering him the Phial of Erendil, and she saw the moment when she had refused the One Ring, rejecting the temptation of ultimate power. But as the ripples faded, the water stilled, and the reflection that stared back at her was not her own. It was the face of Annatar, smiling with cruel, knowing eyes. His voice echoed in her mind, soft and insidious. "You have won, Galadriel," the voice whispered. "But you carry me with you, now and forever. The darkness is in you, just as it is in the world. It can never be truly defeated." Galadriel gasped and pulled her hand back from the water, her heart pounding in her chest. The image faded, but the echo of Annatar's voice lingered in her mind, a shadow that would never fully leave her. In the days that followed, Galadriel withdrew further from her people, retreating to the quiet places of Lothlorien where she could be alone with her thoughts. She knew that her time in Middle-earth was drawing to a close, that the time of the Elves was ending, and that soon, she would need to leave these shores and return to the Undying Lands. But the thought of leaving Middle-earth filled her with a deep, aching sorrow. She had lived through ages of darkness and light, had seen the rise and fall of great kingdoms, had fought against the shadow and resisted the temptation of power. But now, at the end of all things, she felt weary, burdened by the knowledge that the darkness she had fought so hard to contain still lingered within her. The world around her seemed at peace, but Galadriel knew that peace was fleeting. The shadow would rise again, as it always had, and when it did, Middle-earth would need new defenders, new keepers of the light. But she would no longer be here to guide them. One final evening, as the stars glittered above the forest canopy, Galadriel stood at the edge of the forest, looking out over the land she had called home for so many years. The wind whispered softly through the trees, carrying with it the voices of her people, the echoes of their long and storied history. But Galadriel felt only the emptiness that had settled in her heart. The darkness had been bound, but the cost had been great. She had given up so much, and in the end, the shadow remained, both in the world and in her soul. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of ages pressing down upon her. The time had come to leave, to sail west and seek the peace that had eluded her for so long. But as she turned away from the forest and began to walk toward the Grey Havens, she could not shake the feeling that the shadow would follow her, even to the Undying Lands. For though the light had triumphed over darkness, it had not destroyed it. The shadow would always sleep, waiting for the day when it could rise again. As Galadriel descends deeper into the heart of darkness, the trials ahead will push her to the edge, both in body and spirit. Will she be able to resist the shadows of Morgoth that haunt her past, or will the darkness claim her? Stay tuned for more of the Shadows of Sauron, and remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss a moment of this dark journey. And if you missed the beginning of Galadriel's quest, check out the previous episodes linked in the card above. The shadow awaits.